Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please? Ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Tonight, we're fortunate to have not one, but two journalists of national fame as keynoters. As White House correspondent for the New York Times, Maggie Haberman has a bird's eye view of how the Trump administration and the press intersect. Brian Stelter is chief media correspondent for CNN and host of Sunday morning's Reliable Sources, which examines how we as journalists do our jobs and how we affect the stories we cover. You can be sure both have plenty of insights to share about the current White House scene. Consider this segment of the evening the Deadline Club's version of Reliable Sources, as Brian interviews Maggie. You'll find their bios in your printed program, and I'm pretty sure you'd rather hear more from them than from me, so their conversation starts now. Maggie and Brian.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It is a real blessing to be able to go for more than 5 minutes without a commercial break. So we will both take advantage of this time. We won't go too long, but we'll go to your questions from the audience in a few minutes. Maggie, we're up here during a Trump rally, and I wonder, first of all, how do you stay online during an evening like this? Do you wish you were out in Pennsylvania at the rally?
Practice. No, and thank you all very much for having us. I don't actually wish that I was out in Pennsylvania right now, but mostly because I can be at home tonight. But no, I mean, look, I do feel the need to keep up with these rallies. I do feel the need to monitor basically every word he says, and one of the challenges of being a White House correspondent in this moment with this president is the words are so bountiful that it can be hard to make sure you are aware of everything he's said.
What's the biggest misconception about your beat, about covering Trump and his collision with the press?
I think that, well, I think there's a bunch of misconceptions, and I don't know that any is necessarily bigger than another. I think that people alternately think this is that all of the reporters who are covering Trump are having the time of their lives, and I think that for a lot of reporters covering Trump, this is a very hard beat. It's covering the White House is always a difficult beat. It's always adversarial when you're covering government. This is obviously a different level. In terms of rhetoric and in terms of the interactions that we have with this White House, where there are just some basic competence questions about how they interact with the press. So that's one interaction. And then I think the other misconception, another misconception is I think that people, including sometimes other journalists, misconstrue or misperceive or take a wrong guess about how we get information. And that is an ongoing source of frustration to me.
What are the false assumptions that get made?
Oh, either that if you have something, it's person X gave it to you. They definitely gave it to you, and they gave it to you because, you know, it's a big government with a lot of people in it, and it's the leakiest White House in any longtime correspondent's memory.
Is that still true 2.5 years in? Is it still as leaky as it was in the first few months?
I think it's slightly less leaky, but frankly, there are fewer people, so I think that's part of it.
So the average amount of leaking might be the same.
It's been cut down. The pace might be the same. No, I mean, I think some of it is that I do think that a lot of the reporting that sustained the first several months, which would be characterized as palace intrigue reporting, but in reality is really important for understanding how decisions are made in this particular White House. I would not say that would be true in every White House. But I think a lot of those stories showed you something about this new president, and I think explains something for people who either didn't cover the campaign or didn't follow the campaign. And I think now there is a sameness to those stories, so I think that sort of a certain kind of leak, which is about internal knife fighting, has become, you know, less interesting if it's just about the sake of the fight.
You had a really interesting leak today, though. For the folks who haven't seen your scoop yet about Chris Kobach, tell us what made this story stand out. Because it looked like you had this bullet-pointed list of the things he wants in order to be immigration czar.
So thank you for the introduction. I hope you all read our story. But
NYTimes.com.
NYTimes.com. Chris Kobach, who had been the Kansas Secretary of State, he's an immigration hardliner. He was the head of the president's now disbanded and very controversial voter fraud commission that the president appointed after an election he won, to say that there was fraud in the election he won and it needed to be determined. But Kobach has been sort of a perennial figure on the outskirts of this White House for a while, and the president has been considering appointing an immigration czar. It's gone up and down as to whether he actually will do that. It depends on the moment. But Kobach gave the White House this list of 10 quote-unquote requirements for serving in this role, and the first was an office in the West Wing, walk-in privileges with the president, meaning you can just walk into the Oval Office, 24/7 access to an either DHS or Department of Defense jet. The czar will need to be on the border once a week, then guaranteed weekends at home in Kansas, using that jet, unless the president wanted him somewhere else. And then a promise, the last one was, he wanted a security detail. The last one was that he wanted a promise that he would be nominated DHS secretary by November 1st of this year, unless he himself decided he didn't want that job. And this took place many weeks ago, as my understanding is when this demands list was offered by him. And people within the White House, and it's circulated a lot now, were sort of taken aback by it. And so, I mean, I think that was a specific kind of thing where the level of sort of what people perceived as entitled demands were frustrating to those working there. And so that was by Annie Carney and me. Annie Carney is another former New York reporter who's now at the White House.
There's sometimes a sense in the Trump age of nothing matters, right? The cliche being, LOL, nothing matters. Do you think stories like the one you broke today do break through? Do they matter? Why do they matter?
I mean, I think that the president has said to some of his advisors recently that he realizes, he said something to the effect of, meaning him, my news cycle is about an hour and a half long now. And that's actually how we feel about our own news cycles as well. So, I mean, I think that I don't know what breaks through these days beyond something that is kind of wall to wall over several days. I feel like the news burns very hot and very bright and very fast, and then out pretty quickly. So, I don't know what impression that will leave, but I guess the way I look at it is that whether it breaks through or not is not why we chronicle these things. We chronicle these things because they're important, or because they say something about this White House, and they're significant facts for history.
And I look at the number of appointees who have withdrawn, and the number of people who have resigned, and the number of folks who are unwilling to even enter the government for various reasons, as evidence that the journalism does matter on a daily basis. Not that that's the goal, but that there's evidence every day of this having an impact.
One of the things that I point to a lot, just in terms of the journalism having an impact, or at least being important for history, is the Muller Report. The Muller Report, and I don't know how many of you have read it. If you haven't, I would really urge you to, because it's fascinating. But the second half in particular, which is about the obstruction of justice investigation into the president, is heavily footnoted with references to media accounts in real time. New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, lots of news outlets that were reporting on instances that witnesses attested to under penalty of perjury when they were being investigated by Mueller's team and by the FBI. And so it was a good moment when the report came out, and we saw, this sort of was an affirmation of not just that the daily journalism had been right, but it did matter. And in the case of one instance that they looked at of obstruction of justice, it was how the president, actually, now that I think about it, it was how the president responded to our stories that then became instances of attempted obstruction potentially themselves. So I do think journalism matters.
What's it feel like when you're on television and the president tweets about you? Because this is still happening, 2.5 years into the Trump presidency. We both experienced it. I think you kind of did yesterday, because you were on CNN's Inside Politics at 8 a.m., and by 8:30, the president was complaining about the fake news political Sunday shows.
I do think that the show we were on was the only one that was on at that hour. So
It's like a trigger for the
probably
tweet.
us.
Well,
I don't know what specifically was bothering him, but something was bothering him. He seems to use individual reporters' names less than he used to. I have noticed that he's going with outlets more, but it's certainly unusual. I mean, so what I remember, this tweet is actually written about in the Muller Report. It's one of the examples that he talked about. I wrote a story about the president and Michael Cohen that ran on April 21st, 2018. I only know this because it was my daughter's birthday. And it was about how Cohen might turn on Trump after years of Trump treating Michael Cohen pretty poorly. And I woke up, and it was a Saturday morning, and I reached for my phone, which is the first thing I do. And there was a text from Mike Schmidt, my colleague, saying, "Don't worry about the tweet." And I was like, it's going to be a good day. And so I went and I looked at the tweet, and he had tweeted about me by name, and I was a third-rate reporter and a crooked H flunky, and it was like 3 tweets. He spelled my name wrong with 2 B's, but that tweet made it into the report because it was an example of, is he trying to sway what Cohen did? I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. I apologize. And that's a little surreal. But it's been a little while since there's been a name tweet.
But yeah, it's a specific name tweet. Lest we think that you live an incredibly glamorous life on CNN, etc., tell us where you were doing your work yesterday on the way home from D.C. You were on the Jersey Turnpike on the way home when you had to pull over?
I have 3 children, as Brian knows and some people in this room know, and we went to Washington where I was doing John King's show, and we drove, and driving home, we hit terrible traffic and assorted other maladies of driving with children. And it became really clear that I was not going to make it home in time for the 7 p.m. Fox News town hall with Pete Buttigieg, who I had to live chat this town hall with, and on our website. So we pulled over at the suggestion of my sainted husband and went to an Applebee's outside of Princeton.
Perfect.
And that was where I did it from. My kids were very happy.
Perfect. Yeah. So tell us about the juggling act. How do you appear to do it all?
I do it all poorly. Thank you for asking. No, I mean, this pace is not sustainable. I mean, something is gonna have to give at some point before the election. We have been in a bit of a lull news-wise, honestly, since the Muller Report.
Yeah, we kind of have been, haven't we?
Right.
Knock on every table.
I was going to say it's 9 minutes left of our panel, but we've been in a bit of a lull, and I expect that will continue into the summer, and then I think the campaign will heat up. I have a lot of help, and I do my job primarily from here, which means that I can be a little more flexible in my time.
But it is vital in this moment to learn how to ride those waves, right? When things are really, really intense, you know that at some point there's going to be a lull at some point, yes. And you kind of hope for it, plan for it. It's like what they tell you when you have a newborn, or when the baby sleeps, you sleep. So the beat is sleeping right now, so right. We should all just enjoy it. Right. Well, I know we both love SPJ. I was indoctrinated into SPJ when I was in college. I was vice president of my chapter, so I feel like I have a little bit of roots here. I've seen a lot of journalism advocacy groups step up and take stands against attacks against the press. I wonder what you think these groups should be doing to try to, not to combat Trump, but combat anybody who's attacking a free press.
I don't think that the groups can be doing anything differently, because I think groups have actually been pretty good, groups that advocate for journalists.
Yeah.
What concerns me, frankly, more is, for example, in what we saw in California with this raid on a reporter by local police, and that's barely made a blip nationally. Well, we hear lots about every act from this White House and from how it has handled certain things. And I think a lot about these things, particularly when it comes down to the hard pass issue, where, and as I'm sure many of you know, the White House has been changing its system on hard passes, which has created a lot of consternation, and that's appropriate and understandable. On the other hand, when I stopped covering City Hall, I lost my City Hall press pass. I mean, I lost my city designated press pass, and I wish that those were not so easy. There's always been this discussion here about whether the NYPD should be in the business of accrediting journalists the way they do. There is a larger issue. I guess that I fear that people are not seeing that norms, when they start being eroded, it happens more broadly, and it's not just in one place. And so I don't think that groups that are dedicated to journalism can do much more. I do think that people who are interested in freedom of the press need to be advocating across the board. But that's non-journalists, frankly. That's what I'm concerned about.
And your point is it's beyond Washington. There's so many examples of this in other places in this country and around the world.
What happened, certainly around the world. And I mean, the big concern, obviously, about the president's rhetoric, and the publisher of the Times, A.G. Sulzberger, said this directly to the president in the Oval Office in January. You know, your rhetoric is emboldening autocrats and dictators around the world to crack down on press freedoms, and that is very dangerous. But I do think what happened in I believe it was San Francisco, really I found very chilling, and I'm deeply concerned that more people are not talking about it.
You know, let's take questions from the audience in 1 minute, and are we gonna call on people? How are we gonna do it? Okay, all right, so we'll do that in 1 minute. Just one more question for you, but what you think is maybe overlooked too often in the coverage of all things politics right now. We were emailing yesterday before my show, and I was saying I'm still kind of hung up on the president saying that intelligence officers committed treason. You know, the T word on Twitter was just like a 1 hour long story. Like you said, everything's an hour and a half long story. Are there certain pieces of the Trump age that you get hung up on, or you think get undercovered, underplayed?
I think there are a couple, and one of them is what you just said. I think that the fact
jailing of political opponents.
That's just not what we do in this country. Right. We don't threaten to investigate political opponents. We don't threaten to jail political opponents. And this president has been saying it publicly, and then there's a group of people who will always say, well, that's just how he talks, except according to the Muller Report, he instructed Jeff Sessions on several different occasions, I think it was 3, to have Hillary Clinton investigated. Right. That's not just tweeting angrily, that's a real impact. Jeff Sessions didn't carry it out, but maybe not everybody would refuse to carry out the orders, so who knows? I think that needs to be separated out and not just blurred in with sort of coarseness of language or other aspects of this presidency. And then I do think that there is too much attention still, and we, the collective we in Washington, are all guilty of this. There's too much attention on sort of ins and outs of the White House and not enough at what's happening with various agencies, particularly Department of Education. There is a focus on deregulation at the EPA and a lot of the rollbacks, but I think there are a lot of other agencies where we could be focusing on what's at play too.
What's your favorite thing about the job? And my late mentor, David Carr, who of course you knew well, he would always say about journalism, well, it beats working. I mean, and I definitely have come to believe that too.
That is my favorite thing about the job. No, it's the best job in the world. We're incredibly lucky. This is we are doing something that is interesting and different and unique, and we obviously have a front row seat to history. I do think it's important to remember there's someone in this room who's one of my former mentors, who also used to say to me when it would come down to all of us taking things too seriously, you know, we're not curing cancer, and we're not. But that said, I do think what we're doing is really important, and it's an interesting, unusual job.
We get to ask the questions about why cancer hasn't been cured yet. And that's a key role too.
Correct, right? Exactly.
So let's take questions from the audience. I'm gonna see if I can spot any hands over on this side or over on this side. Oh, we have one over here. Let's see if we, go for it.
All right, when you're interviewing someone thanks. When you're interviewing someone and you find their views or opinions, stances or decisions, bills that they pass, you find them to be bizarre maybe, or outlandish, or offensive. How do you interview them without becoming antagonistic or turning it into a debate and possibly alienating them? So, yeah.
It's a good question. I mean, I generally like to just let people talk. I mean, my whole theory of the case on how to interview Trump going back into the campaign was let him talk. And he'll don't. There are times where he will sort of just keep talking, and you need to cut him off. But there are times when it is good to just sort of run the tape and hear what he has to say. I think that journalists need to inject themselves into these interviews as little as possible, unless it is actually trying to extract information, but not to seem like you're taking an opinion. One thing I would say about your question, just about views that you asked it as views that seem bizarre. I mean, one of the, I think the problems with the current era is that because the president says so many things that are either controversial or unusual, shall we say, or whatever, he sometimes says things that actually do have a basis in fact, but they sound so strange that we don't really believe it, and then I think we take an incredulous stance when maybe we shouldn't. And so one of these was something about, he's had this line at rallies over the last couple of months about immigrant caravans and about mothers giving young girls birth control pills because of sexual assaults. And the first time I heard this line, it sounded very strange. And I asked the White House about it, and there actually was a fair amount of documentation about this. So that's also important to bear in mind.
That's a good point. Other questions? We have a hand over here in the front. Can we bring a microphone over? Oh, actually, I'm sorry, you have the mic. You first, and then we'll go over here. We'll go over to Myra next, yeah.
Thank you. So hi, my name is Sarah Baum. I was one of the student scholarship recipients here tonight. I'm very thankful to be here. I'm just finished my freshman year of college, but I've already started my career in freelance, and this is something I think you might be able to relate to. I know being a journalist, you're always subjected to backlash and people who don't like what you have to say, but I've also been receiving a lot of death threats, even this early on in my career, and especially in a time where people like us have seen so much violence with Jamal Khashoggi and the guy who sent the bombs to CNN. How do you stay safe while continuing to say the truth unabashedly?
It's a somewhat scary time out there. I wish I had a better answer than that. I don't. We obviously have discussions about it internally at the Times. I'm sure CNN does as well. I try to bear in mind that a fair amount of the vitriol online is just vitriol. I used to get some pretty nasty letters when I was at the New York Post too, and there was a guy who used to call and leave me threatening messages every day, and frankly those were much more personal and direct. And there was ultimately a restraining order against him. I think that the difference for me is that I was able to identify who that person was. Some of these, like, you just don't know, and you have to just kind of go about your day, but you can't do your job in fear. You just can't.
Thank you.
We'll bring the microphone over to Myron. Let's see if there's one more over on this side. Anybody have the mic over here in the meantime? No? Okay, go for it.
Here. You look like two nice guys to be enemies of the people. In this room contains several different generations of journalists, some of them aspiring, some of them retired. Do you think this president has done lasting damage to the profession of journalism by calling us enemies of the people?
I do not, because I think the people who are willing to believe that, already had concerns about media and nothing, they were already predisposed to believe it. I don't think it doesn't matter whether he was saying it or not. And I think there are enough people to whom the truth matters and to whom accurate reporting matters that they don't listen to what he says. I will tell you that here's what I think turns people off about journalism in this era, and it has nothing to do with the president. It's about what we were just talking about the endless news cycle. That, I think, concerns people, and it should. But I do not believe that the president is going to do lasting damage to the profession.
We have about a minute left, so Maggie, tell us about your big, fancy night you've got ahead of you. What are you going to be doing tonight? What are you going to be reading tonight?
I'm going to be reading the Michael Cohen transcripts on my way home.
These are hundreds of pages from Congress that were just released.
And then there are a couple of other stories that I have to deal with before midnight. So,
a couple other stories.
There's two.
All in one day.
Yeah.
It never ends.
Right.
Maggie, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us here.
Thank you.
And thanks for supporting the Deadline Club.